A loud horn blared as the car in front of me suddenly came to a halt. Something had barreled across the road, something big. I slammed on the brakes and prayed that the icy highway would prevent another rear-end collision. Through the dense veil of the snowstorm, it was hard to make out any shapes, but I could see that whatever had crossed the interstate had done so with speed and precision. Maybe a moose? I thought to myself and paid it no further attention. I leaned back and turned up the radio volume. Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run filled the cozy interior of my Ford Explorer, and I felt my heartbeat gradually calm. Several hours had passed since I left my hometown of Bismarck, North Dakota, and now I was surrounded by an endless white expanse as far as the eye could see. There should have been forest on both sides of the interstate, but with the severely deteriorated weather conditions, it was impossible to see anything more than a few feet away. As I drummed my fingers perfectly in time with the song on the steering wheel, my impatience grew. We had been stuck for at least 5 minutes now. Surely there couldn't be much traffic out here. The song was nearing its end, and we still hadn't moved. Behind me, I could hear a chorus of aggressive honking. At least 6 trucks were behind me, and as far as I could tell, probably 6 more in front as well. Their headlights were the only indication of their presence, as the snow had made everything else invisible. Then a dark thought spread like wildfire in the depths of my mind. Had there been an accident? I sat up and tried to look over the truck in front of me. It was in vain. What's going on here? I muttered softly as a loud sigh escaped my body. The howling winds outside battered the exterior of the truck, destroying any notion that I could go outside and check. For now, it was best to just wait it out. It would surely pass in a minute or two. I took out my phone and began fiddling with a few apps. I don't support texting while driving, but since we hadn't moved for a while, I thought a short social media session couldn't hurt anyone. Besides, it didn't look like I was getting anywhere soon. I even glanced at the half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels lying inconspicuously on the passenger seat's floorboard, but decided against it for now. Before this traffic jam, I had visited my extended family for the holidays in Bismarck. For reasons we don't need to delve into, I was forced to leave earlier than originally planned. Which was fine with me, as I couldn't stand another second of the talkative family dramas and the terrible holiday atmosphere. Forgive me if the details are sparse, but for privacy reasons, I won't disclose the exact highway number or my current destination. All you need to know is that the road I was driving on was quite far in the northwestern part of the United States, near the Rocky Mountains, and it was absolutely freezing. Time passed, and the vehicles on the highway hadn't moved an inch. It was as if they were stuck in the icy foundations. Terrified, I watched as the truck in front of me was swallowed by the rapidly growing snowfall. The tires were almost completely covered, and I thought it wouldn't be long before it became more important to get home in time to watch tonight's Super Bowl. Then, in the distance, I heard sirens. I looked up from my phone and directed my gaze to the side mirror, where I saw a faint blue flashing light piercing through the snowstorm. An ambulance sped past me at breakneck speed, shortly followed by a police cruiser, a black Chevrolet Tahoe. This only confirmed my suspicion that something terribly wrong had happened. I continued scrolling on my phone and kept typing as usual, though my digital efforts proved to be quite futile. The longer I used my phone, the worse the connection seemed to get. TikTok and YouTube videos began buffering, and other apps that required an internet connection wouldn't even load. I'm no physicist, tech guru, meteorologist, or whatever the appropriate title is, but I suspected that the ongoing storm might be related to the weaknesses in my phone signal. Coincidentally, I was also in the middle of nowhere, 40 minutes from the nearest settlement, and 3 hours from the next city. The remoteness of my location would certainly also affect my... A light tapping on the window startled me, and I flinched in my seat. Damn, I thought as I saw a burly police officer on the other side of the glass. Apparently, he had been out in the storm for too long. His cheeks were rosy, and he had snowflakes in his bushy mustache. I quickly shoved my phone back in my pocket and rolled down the window to explain why I was on my phone while driving. But the officer didn't care. "Good evening, sir," began the officer. "There's been an incident further up the road. We're currently trying... Could you please turn that down?" He gestured to the radio. Sorry, officer, of course." I replied, turning the volume knob all the way down. As I was saying, we're trying to evacuate this entire area. Once I reach the last car at the end behind you and get them to reverse, I want you to follow immediately. You want me to back up? I asked, making a questioning face. The road is too narrow. At the moment, I don't see any other option. Unless you want to try turning around and risk ending up in one of those ditches here, the officer said with a slight chuckle. But before I could say anything, a thunderous crash echoed a few meters ahead of us. The wind carried the sound with deafening accuracy. The officer reacted immediately, raising his hand over the gun in his hip holster. He took a few steps back and tried to send a signal on his shoulder radio. Another crash reverberated through the fierce wind, followed by another, then another. The noises were unmistakable. They were gunshots. He drew his pistol and hurried toward the source of the sounds. I watched as he slowly disappeared from sight. A white vacuum had completely engulfed him. I stared in shock for several minutes, expecting the officer to return at any moment, but he never did. A small pile of snow had begun to accumulate in my truck, so I quickly rolled the window back up. I could hear another set of muffled shots joining the already dominant ones. It sounded like they were emptying their magazines completely. Then, suddenly, the noises stopped. Silence hung heavily as I sat in anticipation. My mind was full of thoughts and ideas, but the prevailing feeling that gripped my body was an overwhelming sense of fear. What the hell was going on here? I nervously drummed my fingers on the steering wheel. In a moment of weakness, I glanced again at the bottle of alcohol on the floor. I hadn't been without a drink for years. A small sip wouldn't hurt, right? Just to calm my nerves. If I was discreet enough, the officers wouldn't have any way of knowing. Just as I leaned forward to pick up the bottle, my vehicle shook violently. Something powerful had hit my truck. I cursed loudly and straightened up, dropping the bottle. I frantically searched around, looking for any signs of the assailant. I combed through my rearview mirror, the side window, and even the passenger side window. Nothing but a swirl of white dots. Then I noticed something in the snowstorm ahead of me. A black silhouette was growing larger, and soon I could make out what it was. A man, no, two men, and they were running toward my truck. But these guys weren't police officers or any of the first responders who had arrived earlier. They must have been the occupants of the trucks in front of me. Then two more people appeared behind them, either chasing or following the two men ahead. As they got closer, I could clearly see the expressions on their faces. They were terrified. It looked like they had seen a ghost. The first two men ran past my truck. They didn't even look at me. Shortly after, the two people behind them followed, a woman and a boy. They hurried over the ice at high speed while simultaneously being careful not to slip and fall. Before I could react, they were gone, swallowed again by the endless white void. That was definitely cause for concern. Who in their right mind would abandon the convenience of their vehicle out here, in this weather? The driver in front of me cautiously opened one of his truck doors. A medium-built white man with a beer belly stepped out into the cold. He swung his down jacket over his shoulders and stared into the distance. Curiously, I watched him, wondering if he was about to start running too, and then I wondered if I should follow him in case he did. At the moment, it seemed illogical, but on the other hand, these guys obviously knew something I didn't. Maybe there was a gas leak up ahead? Maybe radioactive material was improperly disposed of? My mind raced, searching for logical explanations for my current situation, but finding none. The man took a few steps forward and intensely inspected the snowstorm in front of him. It seemed like something had caught his attention. He took more steps forward, positioning himself in front of his truck, partially blocking my view of him, his left side still visible. But there was something else. In the depths of the snowstorm, something was moving. I squinted, leaned forward in my seat, and stared through the snow-covered windshield. From the left side of the road, approaching oncoming traffic, a large silhouette moved back and forth as it slowly approached the man. Although it was far away, it seemed almost twice his size, but he hadn't noticed it. The man was too busy investigating what had caught his attention right in front of him. An overwhelming feeling of fear coursed through my veins. The way the silhouette moved, I couldn't quite explain, but it felt predatory, like a lion stalking its prey through the dense underbrush of the African savanna just before it pounces to secure a fresh meal. Was it a moose? It didn't look like it. The proportions were all wrong, and it almost looked bipedal, but I couldn't think of any other large animals out here that the silhouette could belong to. I doubted that brown bears ever roamed this area, and even if they did, could they reach that size? It was as if my primal instincts were staring at me, telling me to do something. I felt my fight-or-flight response kick in, but managed to suppress it. I was safe in my warm Ford Explorer. But the man, on the other hand, I had to warn him somehow. If I honked, whatever was chasing him might react immediately. It was too risky. Before I could think of anything, the man screamed in fear. His cries echoed through the thick exterior of my truck, muffled by the layers. I focused ahead, trying to catch a glimpse of what had scared him so much. He turned to flee. He was almost back to his truck's driver door when he buried his face into the cold, hard ground. He must have slipped. The predatory silhouette to his left was now nowhere to be seen. For a brief moment, our eyes met. A familiar expression of unbearable fear was etched on his face. He dug his long, unkempt nails into the snow and slowly crawled forward. And then he screamed again. But this time, not out of fear, but out of pain. He was violently pulled back. I watched in horror as the man tried to fight back, his powdery hands pressed firmly into the snow as if he had a solid grip. He was dragged away from his truck and disappeared from my sight. Just before he rounded the left corner, I could see his blood-soaked hands desperately clutching a tire, and then he was pulled away. I couldn't believe it. It was like a scene from a horror movie, only this was real. It was actually happening. The man's wailing abruptly stopped, and apart from the harsh winds of the snowstorm, no other sounds could be heard. I took out my phone and tried to suppress the trembling in my hands as I dialed 911. As I waited for an answer, I made sure all the doors were locked while keeping my eyes on the spot where I had last seen the man. A couple of long impressions marked the snow where he had lain, and a bloody handprint stained the black rubber of the front tire. Come on, just go already," I muttered angrily into my phone. But I never got past the dial tone. Was it because I had no reception? I had heard that many emergency lines still worked despite poor signals. But at the moment, I tended to believe the opposite. Eventually, I gave up and put my phone away. I curled up in my seat and tried to make myself as small as possible. I can't tell you how long I sat there waiting like that. The concept of time felt irrelevant at that moment. In my reclined position, I still had a decent view of the outside world. There were no signs of movement, just an empty white canvas. I couldn't hear any recognizable sounds either. I watched in slow motion as each snowflake landed and then melted on the glass. The windshield wipers battled fiercely against the snowstorm, swiping away whatever the storm had to offer. Then suddenly, with a slushy thud, something heavy crashed against the window, and the wipers now smeared a viscous red liquid back and forth across the windshield. An almost indescribable feeling of paralyzing horror drilled deep into my soul as I realized what I was seeing. I immediately recognized the sad eyes and the distorted expression of pain that had crossed the poor man's face. Shiny red blood had completely stained his hair, and the man's skin was covered in cuts and tears. But the true horror of this scene wasn't the terrifying sight that greeted me just 12 inches away, separated only by a shattered window pane. No, the true horror revealed itself when I finally found the courage to consider the question I wasn't even sure if I wanted the answer to. Where was the rest of him? Upon realizing that I was looking at a freshly severed human head, I had to scream uncontrollably, and so I did. I couldn't help it. I felt sick and was on the verge of throwing up. It took all my strength to gather a spark of composure that hadn't left my body yet, and I quickly sat up in my seat, frantically searching my surroundings. Still, I saw nothing but a heavy snowfall. I tried to calm myself, knowing that panic would only make the situation worse. I steadied my breathing and sat still, slowly counting down from 10. But the grotesque sight that greeted me every time I looked through the windshield didn't help. So I closed my eyes and kept counting, focusing on controlling my breath. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. But even as I closed my eyes, I still saw his face. The gruesome image had etched itself deeply into my mind, and I felt anxious at the thought that I might never sleep peacefully again. In my distracted trance, I didn't notice that something foreign was filling the air, something ominous. It was a deep sound, barely audible, a stark contrast to the howling winds outside. It was the kind of noise you felt more than heard, if that makes sense. It was low and rumbling, and I swore I could feel my chest vibrate slightly, like being at a concert or a nightclub with a really loud bass. Carefully, I rolled my window down a quarter to better hear the strange sound. It was much clearer now, and the best description would be to call it a sort of low-frequency growl. Its tone fluctuated slightly, as if in sync with short, rapid breaths. It would be quite a powerful display of vocal cords if the sound were organically produced. I did my best to pinpoint the direction the noise was coming from, but I found the task nearly impossible. Perhaps the wind distorted and shifted the sound, but it sounded like it was coming from every direction. I didn't know what to do. Obviously, I didn't want to get out of the truck and run away like the previous drivers before me, but I felt that staying in the truck would only make me a sitting duck. I also had no weapons to defend myself, not even a pocket knife in the glove compartment. The only thing I had was an old Zippo lighter, which I doubted could cause any real damage in a fight. The deep growl subsided and was instead replaced by a howling noise reminiscent of an owl, only much deeper, like someone blowing air into a hollow tree trunk. But this sound was easy to locate, and I could tell it was coming from behind the truck in front of me, where I had last seen the man before his unfortunate end. I directed my gaze toward the source of the noise, expecting to see its owner peek around the corner at any moment, when suddenly I heard another identical set of deep howls from my left side. I wondered how the animal, the creature, or whatever was making those sounds, had somehow managed to sneak past my line of sight and position itself to my left without me noticing. But my pondering was interrupted as the original howl roared through the winter air again, as if responding to the others. And to my complete horror, I began to slowly realize that whatever was making those noises, whatever had killed that man, wasn't alone out here. And then I saw it for the first time. As if on cue, I noticed the dominant silhouette standing in the middle of the road, standing out against the rapid snowfall. It slowly emerged from the devastating snowstorm just a few meters from the truck in front of me, and the creature revealed itself. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, a grotesque affront to all of God's creations on this earth. Its skull resembled that of a crocodile, standing well over 10 feet above the ground. It also had a large crest directly above its eyes, reminiscent of a bull's horns. Its razor-sharp teeth were stained red, and blood dripped from its mouth onto the snow-covered asphalt. The entire creature was covered in dense white fur like that of a brown bear. No wonder I hadn't noticed it until now. It was perfectly camouflaged in the powdery white snow. The rest of its body was hard to make out due to the storm, but I could see that it was enormous, slightly taller than the vehicle it was slowly approaching. It drew nearer, trotting irregularly toward me. Blood still dripped from its deformed mouth. It almost looked like it was smiling. Almost. I desperately looked around the interior of the truck, searching again for something I could use to defend myself. Aside from the bottle of alcohol lying around, I was clueless. At least I could somewhat dull the pain of being slashed by having some alcohol in my system, I thought to myself. Since the creature was now uncomfortably close, I simply tried to drive away. It was true what the officer had said earlier about the extremely narrow road, but given the certain death, I thought it was worth a try. Although I was surrounded by trucks in front and behind, I would have to execute a difficult maneuver successfully to escape. A maneuver where, under these dangerous conditions, I wasn't sure if I could pull it off. But I had to try. I slammed on the gas pedal and the tires spun in the snow, throwing debris everywhere. Still, I was still stuck, pressing even harder, hoping to God that I would break free from my frozen restraints. In my panic, I looked ahead and met the creature's gaze. I could feel its malevolent stare piercing deep into my soul. The wheels kept spinning, but I made no progress. I had waited too long. It was as I had feared earlier. I was trapped. There was no way out. A deafening honk sounded just a few meters away, and I saw that the creature had stopped. It lifted its head and let out another honk. "What the hell do you want?" I sobbed, slamming my fist on the steering wheel. The disgusting thing tilted its head and made another sound. It was as if it wanted to catch my attention, or distract me. Before I noticed, I felt a stabbing pain coursing through my entire body, and my world was turned upside down as a massive force struck the left side of the truck, throwing it through the air. The Explorer flipped, accompanied by the sounds of crushed metal. Fortunately, I was wearing my seatbelt. Otherwise, I probably would have broken my neck while flailing around like dirty laundry in a washing machine. When the truck finally came to a stop, I found myself head first in the driver's seat. The vehicle had rolled into the nearby ditch along the road's edge. Beneath me, on the inside of the truck roof, lay fragments of shattered glass and piles of snow. I hadn't fully processed what had happened, so I sat there for a moment, taking it all in. Suddenly, everything felt so calm and quiet. I wondered if I had even survived the ordeal. A warm liquid flowed from my chin into my mouth and then over my entire face. The sharp, coppery taste snapped me out of my trance, and I began to assess the situation. Outside, I heard heavy thuds rapidly approaching the vehicle. Every powerful step rhythmically pressed into the snow, and I could imagine the creature's maw practically foaming at the prospect of a fresh new meal. The steps suddenly stopped right in front of the driver's side window, and I turned my head for a better view. A pair of large, sturdy hind legs stood just a few inches from my face. They were covered in reptilian-like scales surrounded by dense white fur, and the creature had 3 long claws extending from each foot. The deafening scratching of metal filled the air as I imagined the creature beginning to scratch at the underside of the SUV. As the monster's feet moved quickly, I began to understand the sheer ferocity with which it attacked. It was insane, tearing apart the exterior at an incredibly fast speed. A combination of honking and growling escaped its bloodthirsty jaws as it shredded the metal. It wouldn't take long before it was through. Another pair of heavy steps stopped only a short distance on the opposite side of the truck, directly in front of the passenger side window. Like its predecessor, it began to scratch and kick at the truck's body. The 2 creatures were relentless. I had never seen anything like it. Not even wild hyenas were so voracious. I braced myself for impact as I unbuckled my seatbelt and positioned myself to prevent breaking my neck upon collision. I slammed hard onto the ground and was greeted by the cold of the snow and shattered glass. The truck swayed back and forth as the creatures attacked violently. It was obvious that I couldn't stay here long, but escaping from the crushed remains of my vehicle and running on foot didn't seem favorable either. A deep sense of despair welled up as I realized that I would most likely not see another day. That was it. Just as all hope seemed lost and I began to accept my fate, my arm brushed against a cold, elongated object. I turned my body to see what it was, and a light bulb went off in my head as I saw the still intact bottle of alcohol lying on the ground. My hands trembled as I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out my old Zippo lighter. But I examined the Jack Daniels and realized that the contents weren't enough for the powerful reaction I was hoping for, so I opened the glove compartment and began searching. Ah, there it is! I cheered as my fingers touched the bottle of fragrant hand sanitizer, an old relic from the pandemic. It was also almost full. I opened both bottles and began pouring the sanitizer into the half-empty alcohol bottle. The sanitizer mixed with the strong herbal liqueur and would surely be enough for an improvised Molotov cocktail. I tore a piece of fabric from my shirt and stuffed it into the bottle's neck. With the Molotov cocktail in hand, I crawled to the broken window. I turned around and pressed my feet against the shattered glass frame. In an adrenaline-fueled state, I pressed my legs down and exerted pressure on the windshield. I tensed my body and pushed my legs harder than ever before in my life, wishing I had spent more time at the gym beforehand. Due to its severely damaged state, it didn't take long for the windshield to shatter, and the harsh winds of the outside world filled the cabin of the head-first turned truck. Above me, the creatures growled and roared, tearing and shredding the frame. I could see narrow beams of light piercing through the underside of the truck, indicating that they were almost through. I crawled through the new opening and out into the relentless snowstorm. I feared that as soon as I went outside, one of the creatures would promptly place my head in their jaws, and I'd be done for. But that didn't happen. It seemed they were too busy breaking through the hard exterior of the SUV, and they hadn't noticed that my clever escape had succeeded. I continued crawling through the snow, praying to God that the beasts wouldn't turn their hideous heads and notice the easy prey slipping right beside them. I didn't dare look back either. I couldn't bring myself to face the abominable creatures. Once I reached a satisfactory distance from the truck, I finally turned around and stood up. I lit my lighter and ignited the Molotov cocktail. Don't try this at home, by the way. With all my remaining strength, I threw the burning bottle onto the pile of scrap that once was my truck and watched happily as the fire rose. I even think I hit one of the creatures, as I heard an astonished howl. The flames weren't large enough to cause a massive explosion or anything, but they were enough to distract the creatures, allowing me to flee. I ran back to the road and drove past all the abandoned trucks that were further up. The ice was stained red, and a few human bodies, or at least their remains, hung from the various deserted vehicles. Eventually, I passed the ambulance and the police cruiser that had arrived about an hour earlier. There were no signs of the officer I had spoken to, but deep down, I knew what fate had befallen him. In the distance, I heard ominous rumbling sounds from one of the creatures, followed by excited honking. Had they finally noticed that I was gone? In that case, I didn't have much time. I got into the ambulance and sat in the driver's seat. A frozen and severed human hand was attached to the steering wheel. I gagged as I tore it off and threw it out the open window. The shrill screams of the creature echoed through the snowstorm, and it sounded like they were getting closer. Desperately, I turned the ignition key of the ambulance, and to my relief, it started without any issues. I pressed the gas pedal and sped away. Fortunately, ambulances in this part of the United States are well equipped to handle dangerous terrain and snowy roads. As I drove, I kept a close watch on the rear-view mirror, hoping to catch one last glimpse of one of the monsters. But the only things I saw were swirling snowflakes effortlessly dancing with the icy winds that carried them. About 30 minutes later, I arrived in a small town. The snowstorm had subsided, and the sun was beginning to set on the horizon. I parked in front of the first roadside motel I found and probably looked like a zombie as I desperately begged the receptionist to alert the authorities. She seemed extremely nervous, but did as I told her. After a while of conversation, the friendly receptionist informed me that the police would be the first to arrive the next morning. Apparently, the nearest police station was an hour away, and the raging storm had caused significant issues throughout the state's infrastructure. Since no one was in immediate danger, they would wait until the roads were cleared and passage was safe again. I wasn't satisfied with this answer, but I was too tired to really care. I checked into one of the motel rooms and began typing everything on my phone. There are still so many unanswered questions, but I imagine more news about the situation will come tomorrow. I just hope that the other drivers along this highway made it out safely, but I have my doubts. The snowstorm had now passed, and outside my window on the second floor, I could see the clear night sky and the endless expanse of the tundra. I have to admit, this landscape is beautiful. It's a shame that I will now forever associate the calmness of the snowfall with the abominable horror of the previous events. But that's not all. As it got warm in my room, I decided to slightly crack open my window. For an hour, I heard the breeze sweeping over the frozen landscape. Strangely, there were no sounds of wild animals here, but something else was there. Occasionally, the silence in the distance was broken by the ever-familiar and ominous sound of a faint howl, screaming out into the night. I never thought it would end like this. The windows of my truck were shattered, blood everywhere inside, the icy wind and snow streaming in as those two empty eyes stared at me like a predator sizing up a helpless prey. Of course, it hadn't started like this. When I set out for my morning run, it wasn't snowing. There was snow on the ground. A few days ago, a swift storm with gusts had left about a foot of white material on the roads. The state quickly took care of it, and traffic was barely disrupted. Everyone went about their cheerful way, even me. The thought that I hated winter more than driving a truck never crossed my mind. Okay, that was a lie. As I drove down Interstate 90, I noticed the small snowdrifts by the roadside and cursed that they weren't big enough to cancel my run. I had to drive my truck through some pretty remote areas, the kind of places that make you yearn for something to break the monotony of 2 lanes of asphalt surrounded by endless pine trees. I had to take this route quite often, and it never got any easier to stay awake. I even imagined seeing strange things peeking out from the trees as I sped by. I knew my mind was playing tricks on me, trying to scare me and keep me alert so I wouldn't crash the truck. If it had been a deer or a wild boar or something, I would have just laughed it off, but this thing looked like it came straight out of a nightmare. so I knew it wasn't real. It couldn't possibly exist, so I pushed it aside and kept driving. Luckily, on a 2-day trip, I could choose where to stay after unloading. Hotels were nice, but if needed, I had the sleeper berth in my Peterbilt cab, which I called my second home. It wasn't bad for cramped spaces. Above the bed, there was plenty of storage space. I had a TV mounted on the wall connected to a Roku, a DVD player with a selection of movies I changed weekly, and there were some paperback books, The Lord of the Rings, Frankenstein, This Present Darkness, along with all the indie author books on my phone. I never had to worry about getting bored. There was always my laptop, filled with novels I started but never finished. The only things I really needed were food and a bathroom. I had snacks hidden everywhere, sometimes in places I hadn't found in months, but that couldn't compete with a nice hot meal. I had my favorite stops along the highway, and they all had two things in common: good food and a quiet place to park and sleep. I didn't like pushing my truck up against other trucks and wondering if I could open my door if they parked like idiots. I preferred to park on the outskirts of a Pilot Flying J. It was more private and I felt less cramped. Of course, there was a compromise. More privacy meant having to walk farther to the rest area, sometimes much farther. But I turned that to my advantage. Nothing like a nice long walk to get the blood flowing in all the muscles I didn't use while driving. Unfortunately, the place was a local family-owned business. That meant they didn't have the money to stay open around the clock. Normally, I'd drive my truck into my spot in the evening, grab something to eat from the vending machine at noon, then stock up on supplies for the night. I'd always go in one last time to use the bathroom shortly before closing at midnight. That evening, I followed the same pattern. Drove in, went to the store, got something to eat, and headed back around midnight to use the bathroom and get supplies before returning to my truck and falling asleep. Usually I try to keep an eye on the weather. For some reason, I didn't that day. I woke up around 8 in the morning and looked out at a sea of white. It had snowed heavily. It looked like someone wanted to make up for the winter month in just 8 hours. I put on my winter gear and went outside to see how bad it was and whether my truck would even be drivable today. As I stepped out of the cab, my visibility vanished. At least 2 feet of snow covered the ground, and it was still snowing. I trudged around the truck to make sure everything was okay, then climbed back into the cab after shoveling as much snow as possible. I climbed into bed and turned on the news, which announced that a severe blizzard had hit the area. Wow, I thought. That's some great investigative reporting. They were forecasting another foot of snow before the snowfall stopped. Great. Time to call the boss and give him a piece of my mind. "Why can't you be here?" he growled. "There's something like snow," I said. "It falls to the ground and piles up until it disrupts traffic." "Well, Smarty, when do you think you can be here?" "Well, since I haven't seen a snowplow yet and I'm parked in a lot that's probably going to be cleared much later than the highways, and my tires are almost worn out, even though I've told you for months they need to be changed, I have no clue when you'll get to see your precious load." He was silent for a long moment. "Do you like your job?" he said with barely concealed anger. "Not particularly," I replied. Then I added, "If the weather is like this, you might want to update your resume." With that, the line went dead. "Thanks for your support," I said to the dial tone. I leaned back, turned off the TV, and fell back asleep. When I started working in the truck, a colleague gave me a tip I never forgot. Every time you get the chance to find some peace, take it. That little piece of advice has helped me enormously over the years. A little extra sleep means a lot less coffee. A few hours later, I woke up and peeked outside. It was still snowing. I looked out the windshield and noticed that even my tracks had vanished. I felt the urge to use the bathroom and decided to brave the elements and make my way to the rest area for some relief. I felt a bit silly as I donned my full winter gear, including gloves and goggles. However, that feeling didn't last long. It was snowing so hard I couldn't even see the rest area. I drew an invisible line with the side of my truck, aimed in that direction, and started walking. I never read Call of the Wild. I never watched Alive. Maybe I shouldn't have been so eager to venture into this blizzard just to pee. Trudging through the snow and the stormy wind quickly became exhausting. I felt like I should have reached the rest area by now. I stopped and looked around. 2 realizations hit me at the same time. First, I couldn't see the rest area. Second, I couldn't see the truck anymore. As a nice bonus, my tracks quickly disappeared. I tried to focus on my path to the rest area and kept trudging. 15 minutes later, I think by sheer luck, I saw the pilot Flying J appear to my right. My path wasn't exact, but I was close enough to find the place. My winter gear was starting to fail me, especially as the wind sucked fresh air into every little crevice. As I got closer, I breathed a sigh of relief, moving from the cold into the warmth, not to mention a huge cup of steaming coffee. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. Maybe it was frozen. I pulled harder, but nothing happened. I looked through the glass and noticed no lights. I realized the sidewalk wasn't cleared either. Oh no, I thought. The storm has trapped them inside. My hopes for a nice warm bathroom and a steaming hot cup of coffee crumbled. I took one last desperate look at the dark store and turned back to my truck. My disappointment grew as I realized my tracks had vanished. I was now snowblind and navigating without a compass or any means of orientation. I tried to draw an invisible line with the outside wall of the store, hoping it would lead me back to the truck. My cold, wet feet protested as I made my way back to the truck. I pulled my jacket tighter to block the wind. The snow was now up to my knees and felt like I was trudging through mud. In hindsight, it would have been better to wait in the truck until I saw a snowplow on the lot. I had enough empty soda bottles for bathroom emergencies, but there was no point in beating myself up now. I had to get back to the truck to prevent this mistake from becoming fatal. If I got lost and couldn't find the truck, no one would come looking for me. They might only find my frozen body in the spring. That was a cheerful thought. As if my journey hadn't been tough enough already, something got caught in my foot after a while and I tumbled headfirst into the snow. I struggled to get up and quickly wiped the snow from my face, grateful I had worn the goggles. I tried again to orient myself, but curiosity gnawed at me. What had I stumbled upon in the middle of a parking lot? I dug through the snow and discovered the disturbing object. It was a parking barrier. I laughed for a moment until I, horrified, realized I should never have come near such things in the middle of the lot. In fact, a straight line from the store to the truck over the barrier where I had tripped would run about a dozen meters to the right. I scraped off the rest and saw it was running almost parallel to my path. I was completely off course. The positive aspect was that I now had a landmark and could hopefully correct my course. I looked around and found myself in a sea of white. The store was gone and the truck was nowhere to be seen. I took a deep breath and used the barrier to aim toward the truck. Remembering an important fact, these barriers lined the edge of the parking lot and directly behind them was a slope. In hindsight, it was lucky I stumbled upon it instead of stepping over and rolling down the hill, from which I might never climb again. I turned around and aimed for the spot where I thought my truck was when I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye of the shadow of a figure passing by. I couldn't be sure because the snowfall limited visibility to a few meters. It could have just been my imagination. I had been out in the cold much longer than I had planned, and it was time to return to the truck. Suddenly, I remembered why I had even gotten out of the truck. I needed to pee so badly. I quickly looked around and saw nothing but snow, so I pulled it out and let go. I think pulling it out was an oversimplification. I struggled to unzip my frozen zipper while my bladder sent a full red signal that it would open the sluice gates whether I was ready or not. I finally managed and started the yellow stream when the wind changed direction and sprayed over my pants. I quickly turned so the stream faced the wind. When I was done, I looked down at the front of my now wet pants and swore to myself, another reason to find the truck quickly. Wet pants would turn to frozen pants and then to dangerous pants. I glanced at the barrier, now covered in yellow snow, and began my new course. The snow wasn't letting up, and my energy was starting to dwindle, even though I had only been standing around the last 10 minutes. Trudging through almost knee-high snow made me more tired than I had been in a long time. The wind howling in my ears robbed me of my hearing. There was nothing out here to hear, and yet I thought I heard something. I looked around but saw only white. Was that my mind playing tricks on me, like it did while driving when I thought I saw that non-existent creature peeking out from the trees? I turned back to my imagined target and wondered if hallucinations were the first step to freezing. As an answer, the wind hit me with a strong gust and threw me to the ground. If I didn't know better, I would have sworn I felt a huge hand in the middle of my back before I fell. I looked up and saw nothing but snow swirling and forming small tornadoes. I laughed at the irony that they were called snow devils. I guess my own personal snow devil was pushing me around. I stood up and set off toward the truck again. Every step felt like my feet were cemented in place. I stumbled on, trying with whatever reserves of energy I had left to keep going. I couldn't die in the middle of a parking lot, just meters away from my nice, warm truck. That would be the ultimate irony. I kept walking, barely conscious, just wanting to reach my 18-wheeler's safe haven from this relentless storm. My head was down. I wasn't even looking anymore. It made no difference. I knew I would never find it. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack. There was no way I would ever. I crashed into something and fell back. The snow was so deep that I just lay there like a turtle, unable to get up from my back. I looked up and saw that the thing that hit me was the rear corner of the truck. 2 meters to the right, I would have missed it. I smiled, but it took a lot of energy. I focused all I had on getting up. Adrenaline took care of the rest. I marched to the driver's door and reached into my pocket for the key to unlock it. I couldn't find the key. I tore off my glove and searched again. Still no key. Desperation flooded my mind. If I had lost it during one of the times I had fallen in the snow, it was gone forever. And so was I. I leaned against the truck's driver's door, so close yet so far. I could almost feel the warmth through the door. I punched my leg in frustration, but felt more pain than I should. I tapped the other pocket and felt a lump. I tore off the other glove and reached into the pocket, pulling out the most sacred item, the key. Tears streamed down my face, and I quickly froze as I shoved the key into the lock and opened the door. It took every ounce of energy I had left to climb into the cab and collapse onto the driver's seat. A wave of warmth washed over me. I just sat there for a while until I could muster the strength to take off my winter gear. Piece by piece, I threw it onto the passenger seat until I was only wearing my underwear. I reclined my seat and enjoyed the warmth flowing over me like a tidal wave. I imagined sitting on the beach, letting the sun shine on me and the water luring me in. That's how I fell asleep. I woke up with a sore back and stretched as best I could in the seat, then looked out the windshield. The snow had eased a bit and the wind wasn't as fierce as before. There was still no sign of a snowplow, and there was no way I'd make progress without one. In the distance, I could almost see the outline of the store. I wouldn't go back there until the parking lot was cleared. But looking around, I couldn't imagine how long that might take. Already 3 feet of snow were on the ground, and it was still snowing. I crawled into bed and covered myself for a serious nap. Hours later, I began to feel refreshed. I turned around and turned on the TV to see how bad the situation was. I couldn't even receive the local channel, so I popped in a movie. After it was over, I decided to check my supplies, since I might have to stay here for a while. I had enough snacks, chips, pretzels, beef jerky, among other things. As long as I didn't eat too much, I should be okay. I also had drinks in the mini fridge, but water wasn't a problem. All I had to do was bring in some snow and melt it. I just had one last thing to check to make sure I could survive this storm. I looked at the fuel gauge. I rubbed my eyes and looked again at the fuel gauge. I only had a quarter tank left. That might be enough, maybe not, depending on how long it took to be cleared. Obviously, once the plow freed me, I could drive about 100 meters to the gas station. As I looked at the fuel gauge, my eyes wandered to the windshield and the white field stretching out before me. The snow had finally stopped. I didn't know how long that would last. I could finally see the store clearly, but I could also clearly see it remained closed. It was hard to believe anyone was clearing that much snow anywhere. I guess that's why they had the slope along the edges of the parking lot. As I quietly laughed at my realization, my gaze caught a movement. Some kind of animal was running across the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a deer because of the broad antlers on its head. But the longer I looked, the more I realized that creature was something else. It seemed larger than any deer I had ever seen. Its upper body protruded over the snow like a ship. Its face looked shrunk down to a bare skull, and it had massive teeth jutting far beyond its jaw. It was pretty creepy to look at. It was sniffing around in the snow. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that was probably where I had peed. I was simultaneously fascinated and horrified by this thing. I was almost convinced my mind was playing tricks on me when it looked directly at me and my blood ran cold. Its gaze pierced my soul, making me wish I had never come to this place. As it took its first step toward me, I dove back into the sleeper berth and pulled the curtain closed. I trembled for reasons unrelated to the temperature and breathed panically. What was that thing? Did I really see what I thought I saw? How could such a creature exist? I tried to calm down and normalize my breathing, but my mind refused to let go of the image of that thing. It's just my imagination, I told myself. It's just a deer roaming out there. I kept telling myself the same thing until my mind finally believed it. However, I didn't look through the curtain to confirm it. I didn't call it denial. I called it not squeezing the happiness out of me. I pulled out a pack of cheese crackers and turned on the first Die Hard movie to forget the deer outside. 15 minutes into the movie when I felt the first nudge. I didn't know what else to call it. It felt like something had bumped my truck. It was almost as if a strong gust of wind was shifting the cab. But I heard no wind outside. The two sides of my mind were arguing over whether to check it out or ignore it. Fear threw its 2 cents in, and ignore prevailed, until the second nudge. In fact, it was like the 5th or 6th nudge until curiosity took over and made me check it out. I peeked through the curtain and saw nothing but snow through the windshield. I stepped out and looked through the passenger window but saw nothing. I berated myself for my nervousness as I looked through the driver's window and saw antlers. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but they were gone. There were tracks in the snow that looked like deer tracks, only bigger. Or was that just my imagination again? I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the creature nudging my tire with its antlers. I was pretty sure it couldn't flatten a tire with just antlers, but I didn't want to take any chances. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door to shoo it away, but it was gone again. I started to doubt my sanity. Was this thing real? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or was the creature toying with me, trying to lure me out of the truck? I closed the door and went back to my movie, but just couldn't get the creature out of my head. I was on edge, waiting for the next nudge to come. Before the movie ended, I fell into a restless sleep. I found myself in a tall building surrounded by villains. I had a machine gun, but it would have been better used by hiding and taking them out one by one. I crept up to one guarding an isolated floor as I turned the corner, and there stood the deer creature. It was huge, standing on its hind legs with its antlers scraping the ceiling. It stared at me with those empty eye sockets from its bare skull face. It made a sound that was half grunt, half growl, and started charging toward me. I ducked around the corner and tried to get back to my hiding spot, but as I was about to start running, the creature suddenly stood in front of me. I raised my machine gun and started firing short bursts. I hit it in the chest, but it kept coming. As I backed away, I fired several shots at its head. I watched bone fragments fly, but it kept coming as if it didn't care. I shot at its legs, hoping to trip it up, but it had no effect. As if it had had enough, it lunged at me and pressed me against the wall with its antlers. I looked down as blood began to seep from my abdomen around its antlers. It pulled back and charged at me again, sending shockwaves of pain through my body and crushing my spine. It pulled back and let me fall to the ground. Blood pooled around me as I tried to push myself away from the creature. I could only use my arms. I felt nothing below my waist, which was a partial blessing because it halved my pain. After crawling a few meters, it had probably had enough of playing with me. It stomped its foot so hard on my neck that I heard a crack and my arms went numb. I felt it tear into my back and flesh pieces peel off. I heard the disgusting chewing and slurping as I was being eaten alive. I woke up with a jerk, sweat streaming from my forehead, and looked into the sleeper berth, searching for the creature that had torn me apart. After a few seconds, I realized it had been a nightmare. I turned off my DVD player and stuck my head through the curtain to check my fuel level. The needle was well below the quarter mark, almost on an eighth. I looked through the windshield, and the snow hadn't magically melted. In fact, the wind had picked up again, and it was starting to drift. Where there had once been an even blanket of snow, now there were peaks and valleys like dunes in the desert. The store was still dark, and no traffic was moving on the road. The sun was low in the sky, and I hadn't seen another living soul. I wondered if my fuel would last until a snowplow arrived. Soon, I'd have to seriously consider conserving it. It wasn't ideal. The thought of wrapping myself in blankets in the dark with no heating and no TV wasn't exciting, but it was better than waiting until my fuel ran out and I froze to death. As I turned off the engine, I berated myself for not devising this plan sooner. I could have saved fuel when the sun was shining and temperatures were higher. Now I would pay for my lack of foresight. I pulled out every blanket I kept in my cabinets and laid them over the bed, then cuddled up for a long nap. When I woke up, I was drowning in complete darkness. I panicked for a moment before remembering where I was. I looked at my watch. It was 4 a.m. I immediately pulled the blanket off and was instantly assaulted by cold air. I grabbed a flashlight and found my way back into the cab. I turned the key and waited with held breath, which escaped as clouds from the cab until the engine started. As it roared to life, I felt even colder. I looked to the left and froze. My driver's side window was in pieces on the seat and the ground. Slowly, I turned around to look at the passenger window as fear gripped me. A face was staring at me. But it wasn't a human face. It was the unholy face of the deer creature that had stomped me to death in my dream. A stream ran down my leg, forming a yellow puddle on the ground as I stared into the dark, hollow eyes of this creature sent from hell. It threw its head back and then slammed against my passenger window, shattering it. It stretched back again, and this time broke the window, grabbing me with its long, terrifying teeth. I jumped back and landed on the driver's seat, covered in glass shards. I knew I was dead. There was nothing I could do. I sat there as it entered the cab to get me. Its head was half in the cab when it suddenly stopped. It moved a bit, then roared in frustration. Its antlers were too wide to fit through the window. It kept trying to get in, but there was no way it could get through with its antlers. As suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. I looked around to see where it had gone, but the darkness of the night cloaked it like a veil. As I watched, it reached quietly behind me and would have eaten me if it hadn't been shoved away to warn me of its approach. I dove into the center console as its deadly jaws snapped exactly where my spine had been. It continued its attack on that window and grew more intense as it frustrated itself for not being able to grasp me. I stood between the two windows, hoping to be safe from both directions. Then I decided to go back to my bed and close the curtain. I covered myself and reached under the bed to a secret compartment, pulling out my semi-automatic .40 caliber pistol. I took the magazine out and checked if it was loaded with all 10 rounds, then put it back, pulled back the slide, and turned on the safety switch. That made me feel a little better, but not much. I didn't know how true my dream was, or if bullets could do anything to this monster. I had no illusions that this was a deer. It was something much more dangerous and horrific, and it was after me. I covered myself again with my blankets, holding my weapon close. The heater did nothing against the 2 broken windows. I would try to deal with it in the morning when it was light. There was no way I could handle something with this thing lurking outside in the dark. I lay there for an hour, watching every second the clock ticked by with open eyes, listening to every sound. But there was none, just the wind howling between the 2 broken windows and making my curtains flutter. Eventually, I realized the futility of letting a truck run and just letting the warm air escape before it could even reach me. So I got out of my bed, held my new best friend tight, and slowly made my way back to the cab, shaking my head back and forth to see if the creature would shoot through one of the windows. I turned the key off, and before I could pull it out of the ignition, a set of antlers hit the window frame, and the deadly teeth sliced just centimeters from my face. I quickly turned around and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. It snapped at me again, and I panicked until I noticed the safety switch was on. I turned it off and aimed, but the monster was gone. I didn't dare move toward the window, fearing it would crash back in. I stood still like a statue, staring at the window it had come through, then slowly turned to the other side. I kept looking back and forth, trying to keep my peripheral vision on both simultaneously. I trembled, not just from the cold, but also from the sheer fear of not knowing where or when this thing would appear. I decided that my winter gear was the best option, so I got back into bed and put on as many layers of clothing as I could find. When I stuck my head out again, I was confronted with the most horrifying sight I could imagine. The monster had climbed onto my truck's hood and was now banging its head against the windshield to get in. I knew the windshield was wide enough for its antlers to get through, and I was done for. I raised the gun, aimed at its head, and fired. The explosion was massive. I immediately lost my hearing, aside from the ringing in my ears. I staggered back, but the monster kept coming. Not only had my bullet done nothing to the monster, it had weakened the windshield and made it easier to get in. The monster shook its head in surprise as the bullet bounced off its bone, then continued its attack on the windshield. It hammered at the glass until it shattered into a million pieces. I was already aiming at its face and fired 2 shots before the glass hit the ground. Both bounced off its skull, causing it to only slightly retreat, allowing me to fire 2 more shots into its chest. It didn't collapse and didn't scream in agony like I wanted, but I could see it didn't like it either. It jumped off the hood and vanished. I stared into the pitch-black darkness, trying in vain to catch a glimpse of it. I turned from one side window to the other and back, waiting for it to show its terrible face. After an eternity, I saw antlers rising through the passenger window. I fired a shot into its face, and it disappeared. I threw myself back onto the passenger seat when I suddenly saw its head rise in the driver's side window. I fired a shot, and it disappeared again. I jumped up and threw myself onto the other seat, knowing it would soon be on the passenger side. Indeed, it appeared 10 seconds later, and I fired another shot. It was playing with me. It vanished, and I threw myself over onto the passenger seat, waiting and aiming at the empty driver's side window. Instead, I felt teeth clamp around my neck. It had tricked me. I shoved my gun under its skull and fired a shot. If I hadn't been deaf from the first shot, that one would have taken me out right next to my ear. And yet, I somehow heard it squeal in pain as it released me. I knew I was only centimeters away from death. I grabbed my neck wound and pulled out with a handful of blood. I went back to my bed, tore a piece of the bedsheet, and pressed it onto my wound. Then I tore more of the sheet and wrapped it around my neck to secure the bandage. I returned to the cab, only to see it crouching on the hood of my truck, waiting for me. I never thought it would end like this. The windows of my truck were shattered, blood everywhere inside, the icy wind and snow streaming in as those 2 empty eyes stared at me like a predator sizing up a helpless prey. It crawled through the remains of the windshield. I knew I was dead. In desperation, I shoved the gun into one of its eye sockets and pulled the trigger. The sound it made was something I had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. The scream was both a deep guttural noise and a high-pitched screech. It sounded like someone had unleashed a demon from the depths of hell. My mind screamed at me, "Get out of here!" I stumbled around with the driver's door and fell out as it opened. On a clear day without snow, I would have suffered a concussion or broken bones as I fell onto the bare asphalt. Landing on a meter of snow on the ground, I landed on a soft, cold pillow. It was the only time in the last 24 hours that the snow had helped me. I immediately sprang up and looked for a hiding spot, but there was none. Everything was covered in snow. I looked back at the trailer and noticed the snow was so high it reached the lower part of the trailer. I couldn't see anything underneath. I quickly dove underneath, then turned around and tried to shovel snow into the opening to hide where I had gone. I swept my flashlight around and saw the beautiful sight of bare asphalt. I lay there on my stomach, looking around in all directions to see which way the monster would attack. My breath escaped as desperate clouds of smoke while I failed to find any. There was nothing. The monster wasn't there. Not yet. I didn't dare hope that my bullet had killed it. If anything, it probably made it angrier. It was likely destroying the inside of my truck at that very moment. What I didn't trust was that the monster wouldn't find me under the trailer. I looked around for a better hiding spot. My eyes fell on the truck's wheels. It looked like there was just enough space between the tires and the differential. It would be a tight squeeze, but better than having this thing find me. I turned around and pushed my feet in first. The further I pushed, the tighter it became. Ironically, the grease and oil from the differential helped me shove through a bit easier. As I was almost through my shoulders, I suddenly felt it getting too tight. I was stuck. I couldn't move forward or backward. Panic flooded my mind, and I struggled desperately as if I couldn't breathe. After the longest minute of my life, I finally managed to maneuver my shoulders through and into my hiding spot. The hood of my coat served a dual purpose of keeping me warm and completing my hiding place. I lowered it down to the level of the asphalt and would only raise it an inch if I wanted to peek out. The first half hour was the worst. The ringing in my ears had started to subside, but I still heard nothing but my own breathing. The cold slowly seeped through my clothes. Still no sign of the monster. Another hour passed. My muscles began to cramp. Still no monster. Another hour. I felt like my bladder was about to burst. Still no monster. During the long boredom in between, I took the magazine out of the gun and counted how many bullets I had left. No matter how many times I counted, it always came to the same number, 1. I knew one bullet wouldn't save me from the monster. There was only one way to deal with one bullet, ending my suffering if it found me. I took it out of the magazine and stared at it. I used my coat to brighten it, then stared at my reflection in the shiny metal. The edges of the snow around the trailer began to glow. I knew the sun was rising. The darkness was no longer my friend. I was about to give up and crawl out of my hiding spot when I heard it, a faint sniffing. I lifted my hood an inch, just enough to peek out, and there it was. Its head had broken through the snow wall, near where I had dipped under the trailer. There were a few drops of blood from my neck wound, and it was sniffing at them. These drops would lead it straight to me. In fact, it turned toward the front of the trailer and looked in my direction. I was still lying there like a stone as it slowly approached me. It struggled to push its massive body under the trailer, and I could hear it growling in frustration. It got closer and crawled directly toward me. There was no doubt it knew I was there. I closed my eyes and tucked the barrel of the gun under my chin. I felt its hot breath and smelled the stench of death as I pulled the trigger. Suddenly, it screamed, and I could feel the truck lurching above me. I opened my eyes to the most amazing sight. Its antlers had gotten tangled in the chains hanging under the trailer, and it was ensnared. It screamed and shook and struggled to free itself from the metal restraints. It pulled back so hard that I felt the truck shift an inch to the side. The differential was now pressing on me, and I had to bend down to avoid being crushed. I watched as the chains came loose one by one, and then it was free. I took the opportunity to crawl out of the trailer. It was now useless as a hiding spot. It had already tracked me here. I was almost out when I heard another noise and saw a shadow pass by the other side of the truck. It came back, but from the other side. I crawled as fast as I could. That was my chance. If it was searching from the other side, it might not know I had left. I had no idea where I was going, but it was better to get out of a useless hiding spot. Besides, I desperately needed to stretch and pee. As I stood next to the truck, I saw a large red area in the snow. I guess it wasn't as useless to shoot as I thought. I took care of my business first and peed before ruining another pair of pants. I finished and thought about where I could hide. I looked at the destroyed cab of my truck as the nightmare crawled around the corner. I stood there, helpless. It had caught me red-handed. I had nowhere to go. It stared at me as it limped and crawled around the corner. Its empty eyes seemed to radiate anger. I raised the gun and aimed as it slithered into a moving snowdrift. The snowplow had finally arrived. I watched as the plow pushed its snowdrift past my truck and over the edge of the parking lot. The driver reversed and pulled up beside me. "Have you been here all night?" the driver asked. "Since before the storm." "What happened to your truck?" he asked, looking at my shattered windows. I followed his eyes and thought for a moment. "Someone tried to rob me," I lied, knowing the truth was unbelievable. "I see you've taken care of it," he said, looking at the gun in my hand. I looked at the gun and tucked it into my waistband. "It was a damn long night," I said. "Well, don't worry. The roads are being cleared, and I'll tow you out of here." "Thanks," I replied. He nodded and continued to plow beside me. I looked where he had just plowed past my truck and saw a long red stripe. I followed it to the edge of the parking lot and looked over the side with my hand on the gun. The slope was well over 10 feet deep, and the snow was already starting to pile up. I followed the red trail down the hill with my eyes and saw antlers sticking out of the snow. I stared at them, searching for any movement. For 10 minutes I watched, and they didn't move. I was interrupted when the plow pushed another snowdrift over the side, covering the antlers. I watched for another 5 minutes just to be sure. The plow driver rolled up beside me. "All good?" he asked. I took my eyes off the snowdrifts. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Are you sure?" he asked, pointing to my neck. "Yes, I just got some glass stuck," I said, remembering the monster's teeth that had clamped around my neck. "Well, I think someone just drove into the store," he said. "Maybe you should get something for that." "I'll do that, thanks," I said, knowing I would never do something like that. I wanted to avoid as many questions as possible. I climbed into the cab, brushed the glass dust off my seat, and drove to the fuel pumps. After fueling up, I began the long drive home. I kept my winter gear and mask on. Without windows or a windshield, the ride was icy cold. The heater was on maximum and directed at my feet, keeping the lower half of me warm. I didn't call a tow service because I wanted to get away from there. I never went back to that rest stop. I didn't want to risk that thing was still alive. I told no one about the horrifying encounter. I wished I could erase it from my memory. As I drove to my home terminal through the endless row of trees, I saw one of the creatures I had previously thought was my imagination peeking out from the corner of my eye. Now I know better. I don't know when this message will be sent. I'm using my phone, which only receives a signal for a few seconds every few hours, so I could just send this message into the void. And that's a problem. A problem because our town, Frostburg, where I've lived my entire life, is in such dire straits that I don't believe we'll survive much longer. The only light beside my phone is a candle that threatens to go out with every gust of rattling wind. The cold wind I can't shake off from the library where I've taken refuge keeps me restless. I don't dare to start anything. The small diesel generator in the basement is only managing the basics, and fuel is running scarce day by day. At least I have my tea and a heavy blanket draped over my shoulders. But the cold of this storm has seeped into my bones. It has infected every part of this town, and if these are Frostburg's last days, at least others should know what hell we've been fighting in vain. It all began with rolling gray clouds that rose on the horizon and swept over the distant Rockies like a thick layer of sludge. They spread across the entire town, blocking the sun and leaving us in a twilight that everyone found strange and became the talk of the town. The television went out after a few hours, and the radio reported nothing of what we were experiencing. I'm starting to believe it will never report it. The storm brought snow, the kind of snow that weaves a thread of worry just by watching it fall. The weather had been unusually mild before the storm rolled in, and much of our tourist appeal comes from the snow that typically blankets the entire town until mid-January. Many went out to greet the storm and the snow, knowing what was coming. I stood on my porch, watching the snow fall into the night, the streetlights glowing behind it, unable to shake my concern. The streets were covered within a few hours. The whole town knelt to await the storm. We were resilient. A bit of snow was nothing to worry about, even though we all felt an uneasy restlessness. This feeling proved prophetic, as we all could have guessed. The next morning, the snow fell even harder. The world outside my window looked static, and with every blink, another inch added to the already insurmountable snowdrift. It wasn't long before the roar of engines and the scraping of shovels echoed up and down the street. For my wife, Anna, and me, we had bought a snowblower the previous year, and even that struggled to clear the driveway and sidewalks. We added to the already piling snowdrift, and when we were done, another layer settled where we had just cleared. By evening, it looked as if nothing had happened all day, although many determined townsfolk didn't give up until even the snowplows stopped working. The next day, I was one of the few who dared to venture into the snow to go to work. In such a storm, the power would go out, and those dependent on Netflix and YouTube would seek some form of entertainment. Besides, the town hall was old, and I wanted to check the heaters. Walking was a plague, and I had brought my shovel to help me through the snowdrifts. On my way into town, I saw many children enjoying their day off from school in the snow, laughing with joy as they sledded or built snow sculptures. Some even offered to clear the way for me, and I was more than grateful, as these old bones of mine simply weren't suited for shoveling. Main Street had been cleared more than the other streets. Tire tracks were still visible, but a common sight was cars stuck in the snow. Most had been abandoned by their owners and became part of the snowy landscape. It was strange to see a town usually only alive with those who had things to do that couldn't wait. The grocery store, a small Kroger at the end of the street, looked like it had been looted. Even from the outside, I could see the shelves through the large windows, and they had never been so empty. I adjusted my backpack as I walked, glad that my wife had convinced me to take supplies in case I got stuck myself. I was sure the other stores weren't faring much better. I reached the town library and sighed. The cold burned my face as I stared at the high snowdrift that had built up at the steps to the front door. The side entrance would have been a better choice, so I began shoveling the path to that door, wondering if I should just stay put. When I reached the door, I was half dead and breathing so heavily you might mistake me for a steam locomotive. The door was swollen, and after a brief struggle, I opened it to find the large main room dark and cold. The weak light from outside seeped gray through the windows, just enough to turn on the lights and check the building. Luck was on my side. The old oil heater was struggling, but not in danger of exploding or giving out. I spent most of the day clearing another path to the sidewalk, but when I was done, it was clear I would spend the night, and all my work had been in vain. Evening came, and the store lights stayed on long after closing time. I became restless and made my way to the small corner cafe, the Warm Heart, and was surprised to find it still open and serving. Besides the staff, there were 3 other people, and as I entered, many turned to me as the little bell above the door jingled. "What a thing," said George as I sat next to him, a burly man with broad shoulders and hands that could cover a book. He ran a small woodworking shop on Main Street. He mainly made bowls and other trinkets that tourists loved. He was a few years younger than me, but the gray in his hair had taken much more of his appearance. No snow, and then, bam, hit like a damn freight train. The others nodded. They had pushed the tables together, so we were all sitting in the middle of the store. Jenna was still behind the counter, a woman in her early 30s with brown hair always tied up in a bun at the back of her head. She had a stern look, but her kindness was legendary among the townsfolk. She played with a cup and stared out the window. She turned back to the group and grimaced. "It's not stopping soon, and we're going to get into serious trouble. We're running out of coffee, and, well, there's no way the power will hold if it gets any worse." "We don't have any generators left," said Kevin. He owned the local hardware store, Miller and Sons. He tucked a pack of cigarettes into his flannel shirt pocket. He seemed to realize what he was about to say and looked hopefully at Jenna. She waved her hand, and he grinned, putting the cigarette in his mouth and lighting it. "Home Depot and Lowe's bought the last 2 from me a few hours ago. If I had more supplies, I'd have made a bundle." "Because those damn things are always breaking," said Jenna, nodding to a door at the back of the room. "Josh took most of his shift to get them running again. The boy is a saint for putting up with it." Kevin shrugged and scratched his beard. "It has a warranty." "Oh yeah, I'm sure those bastards would just drive here tonight to fix it if we asked them," said Sarah, leaning back in her chair. She was a petite woman, still wearing her apron, stained with flour and dye. Her bakery, Sarah's Oven, was one of the busiest spots in town during tourist season. While Jenna seemed like she was having a tough time, Sarah was rather plump with a cheerful demeanor. If there was ever misleading advertising, this would be the first impression you'd get of her. "Damn it, to fix a mixer took almost a month for someone with a clue to come here. I almost had to use a melon squeezer to rip that idiot's eyes out when he told me we had to wait for a part," Sarah said. "Has anyone tried calling someone?" asked George, tossing his flip phone onto the table in front of him. "I'm getting no signal. And you guys?" We all pulled out our phones and realized the problem was the same for everyone, regardless of their carrier. "Landline?" I asked, looking at Jenna. She had a beige phone on the back wall and turned to pick up the receiver. She shook her head. "It just clicks." "Radio was also a desert or an overflow," said Kevin. "But the last weather report I heard said we'd get a few more mild days." "Damn climate change, I bet," said Sarah, raising her cup to take a sip. "They said the weather would change in weird ways. I call that damn weird." "Can't argue with that," I said, looking at Jenna. "Do you have any more tea back there?" She gave me a warm smile that looked almost threatening. "Sure, and I don't want to hear about payment. It's on the house, John." "Hey, if you're giving out free stuff, I'll take one of those muffins from the display case," said Kevin with a grin. "As if you need more food," said Sarah with a mocking smile. "That's a bit inappropriate," said Jenna as she came over the counter with a cup. Sarah shrugged and smiled over the disapproving look Kevin shot her. Jenna placed the cup in front of me and then looked at Kevin. "Maybe later. I need to get rid of fresh supplies soon if we don't get more customers." "Think you've got one now?" said George, pointing to the door. We all turned around and saw a man stumbling in, clad in thick jackets, quickly shaking the snow off his shoulders. He straightened up, pulled back his hood, and looked at us all with trembling breath. "Josh?" Jenna asked, rushing over. "What the hell are you doing outside in this weather?" "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice choked as he coughed to clear it. "Did you all hear what's happening on East Street?" I looked into the group and everyone exchanged confused glances. I turned back. "What's happening there?" "There are statues in the middle of the street." "Statues?" George asked mockingly. "What are you talking about?" "My friends and I were out and drove towards East Street to see how people were trying to dig themselves out." "He's really a model citizen, this one, Jenna," Sarah said. Jenna ignored her and rubbed Josh's arms as she led him to the heater. "Come on, to the heater. So, about these statues, do you think someone brought them here from all over town?" I asked as Josh took off his gloves and rubbed his red fingers. "Like the Liberty Oak from Main Street?" "That would be a damn hike," George said. "Wouldn't have gone far enough for a prank in this shit." Josh shook his head. "No, nothing like that. It's like someone carved them out of ice, right outside the town limits, all facing outward. It was weird. We wanted to take a closer look, but were too scared. I hoped someone could get the mayor or someone to check it out." "I think the mayor has enough on his plate already," Jenna said, looking at us around the table. "Well?" Sarah echoed Jenna. "Well then," Kevin asked. "Don't you three go check it out? If they're on the street, they'll interfere with the cleanup efforts," Sarah said. "To me it sounds like a story spun out of too much grass," George said, looking at me as if expecting me to agree. I didn't, and just stood there with a long sigh. "East Street, huh?" I asked, straightening my coat. "Where are the other friends now?" "Went home. We were all a bit startled, and when I saw the lights were still on here, I thought maybe Jenna knows what to do." "Right. If it's a prank, Mr. Miller, I'll have you organizing the catalog cards every weekend until summer." I put on my gloves and took a final sip of tea. "If I'm not back in an hour, send out the search party." Wait a minute," George said as he stood up from his chair and grabbed his jacket. "You're too damn old to take this route yourself in this shit." "If you want to come, just say so," I said. "I'm coming too," Jenna said as she headed to the back room. "No need. These two old geezers can handle it," Sarah called after her, then looked at me. "Tell her not to go." "I want to come too," Josh said after a moment. I shook my head. "Not necessary. We got this. Go home. I bet your mom has dinner ready. Let us handle it, okay?" Josh nodded, took his gloves from the heater and slipped them on. "Be careful." "We will be," Jenna said as she came back. She wrapped a dark brown wool scarf around her neck. "Now go home, and I don't want you taking any shortcuts." Josh left, and we followed him shortly after, heading in the opposite direction. The air had become bitterly cold, and it wasn't long before we were all sniffling with running noses that we couldn't feel anymore. East Street was about a quarter-mile away, and one of the main roads out of town. As we crossed the town center, we found more and more abandoned cars. Most stores were still open, their lights burning brightly in the gloomy storm. But the closer we got to East Street, the more those lights faded and became sparse. We reached the beginning of East Street and stopped to catch our breath. The road wasn't long, and we could see the last intersection before the brick buildings ended and abandoned lots became the norm. Even from this distance, we could see the silhouettes of cars at the end, some still with their headlights on, creating small patches of glowing snow. The distinctive clicking of keys turning in ignition echoed down the corridor of buildings. "There are a lot of cars," Jenna said, her voice muffled by her scarf. "Can't imagine everyone went out." They probably gave up and went home," George said. "Can't go far with this amount of snow." "Without taking their keys or turning off the car?" I asked, taking a few cautious steps down the street. "Well, Josh wasn't lying," George said, pointing to the end where a snowdrift created a haze. In this haze, I could make out silhouettes that looked strangely human. "There aren't that many statues in town." "No," I said, shaking my head and feeling my skin tingle. "There aren't any." I walked a few meters alone before they joined me. It got colder the further we went, and as we reached the intersection, every uncovered inch of skin began to burn and ache. The wind whipped around us, throwing snow clouds up, and the haze grew thicker. Despite this haze, there was no way to mistake the statues in the snow. "What the hell? Jenna said as she shivered beside me. Her scarf was covered in tiny icicles. "What the hell?" "Tell me what you see," I said hoarsely. I couldn't believe my eyes at that moment. George suddenly stopped beside her, a surprised grunt escaping him. "I don't want to," Jenna said. "They're people," George said slowly. "Are they really frozen?" I nodded and took in the scene. There were about 12 of them scattered in the snow. Their poses were all in different steps, as if they were frozen mid-stride. The outer ice layer was a striking ocean blue. What really shook me was that some of them were looking back as if they were walking, their faces contorted in shocked and fearful expressions. I looked around the area we were in. It was mostly residential homes, but all the windows were dark. I stepped aside and trudged to the front entrance of one of the houses. It was broken into. The lower and upper parts were just wooden pieces with splinters in the middle. It was too dark to look inside, and I wished I had a flashlight as I stuck my head in. "John!" Jenna's voice broke through the whipping wind, and I turned to see the two of us huddled together and retreating. I stumbled down the steps, and as I stood up, Jenna pointed with a trembling hand to the statues. Among them, something large was prowling. 4 legs with a big hump where a dog's shoulders would be. It had thick fur that moved in the wind like water. As we watched, another appeared. They moved like wolves stalking us as we continued to back away. I had never seen such creatures before. I pushed Jenna behind me as George and I moved together. I glanced back at her. "Jenna, go away. But listen to the old bastard. I don't know what those things are, but they're not normal. Go, disappear from here," George said, turning slightly to shove her away. She stumbled into the snow but took the hint and ran off. "There are no wolves here," George said as we continued to back away. The beasts emerged from the dense haze, their black fur stark against the bluish snow. "No, do you have a plan?" George nodded, reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol. "I'm going to shoot them, and then we run like hell. I don't think it's a good idea to anger them. I don't think they'll leave us much choice," he said. And it was almost as if the beasts understood what we were planning as they began to growl. The sound was eerie. "On my 3, George said, aiming the gun. 1, 2, 3. The shot was like a thunderclap in the snowy valley we were in. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the snow a few feet deep, hearing George follow right behind me. Another shot rang out, and a pained scream reached us, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, hoping to reach the town center and the warm glow of the surrounding buildings. George fired again, but this time a pained scream followed as I turned just enough to see him sinking in a snowstorm. One of the beasts had pounced on him in a moment, and bright red blood splattered around him in the snow. I cursed and hurried away, sprinting with all my might to the next building. I pounded on the door and hammered my fists against it. "Open up, let me in. It's John, the librarian. Please, open the hell up." To my great relief, the door opened enough for me to shove myself inside. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, breathing heavily. The young homeowner, a student named Luke, stared at me with a worried expression that turned to fear as something so hard hit the door, bending the steel. I braced myself for the next blow, but nothing happened. It was just silence, as silent as a snowstorm. I waited for the sun with my new friend, and when it shone through the windows, I cautiously went back outside. The snow had settled a bit during the night, so George's body lay clearly right in front of the town center, his blood frozen into icicles around him. Jenna came out of a store where she had spent the night as I stood in front of his body. She let out a small wheeze and hid her face in my shoulder. "What the hell happened, John?" "I don't know. Whatever they were, they weren't wolves." I bent down and brushed the snow off the pistol as I picked it up. "We have a big problem. No one can leave this town right now." "Do you think there are more?" "I think they're just another problem we have. I bet every part of the town has the same icy wind as East Street." I tucked the pistol away and turned to her. "For now, go back to the bakery. Tell everyone who comes in what we found." "What are you going to do?" I looked toward East Street and the haze playing at the end, then at those starting to gather around us. The news of George's death was spreading, and I was still waiting for the consequences. I gave Jenna the only answer I could at the time, and that still holds true. "Damn it, no idea.